Good evening. Welcome, everybody. My name is Steve Rothstein. I'm the Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. And on behalf of all of the foundation and library staff, we're thrilled that you're here. It's for this very special forum that is part of our centennial activities. Before we talk about the guests, just a few quick announcements. First, to thank our sponsors for this, the Bank of America, Lowell Institute, the Boston Globe, Infinity, and WBUR. We appreciate all of their support. When you came in, you received cards, so if you have questions, there'll be people coming around later to collect those, and we'll get to some of those later on. In addition to the full house here, we have folks in another room in the library. We want to thank them. Also, this is being streamed live, so we want to welcome our guests there. They can also submit questions the same way through Google Hangout, and they'd be translated into cards. We are very fortunate to have our guests, our special guest, which I'll talk about in just a second. Before I do that, it's thrilled to have David Gergen back here. We all learned... You all know his leadership both in academics at Harvard, on CNN, and having served 4 presidents, and really his distinguished, it's really amazing, on so many different topics. We're thrilled tonight to have the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and who's currently finishing his fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School. While he was at the United Nations from 07 to 16, he was credited with many, many accomplishments, including international efforts to reduce to address global climate change, peacekeeping, employment. Prior to the United Nations, he had many, many distinguished roles in South Korea, foreign minister, national security advisor, and many, many more. We're also thrilled that his lovely wife is here, Madam Bang Soo-taek, and among her many accomplishments, that we particularly want to note, because it is the Kennedy Library, she is a noted librarian in her own, so we welcome that as well. In 1961, President John Kennedy addressed the United Nations, and he said, quote, "The great question that confronts this body in 1945 is still before us, whether man's cherished hopes for progress and peace are to be destroyed by terror and disruption, whether the foul winds of war can be tamed in time to free the cooling winds of reason, and whether the pledges of our charter are to be fulfilled, pledges to secure peace, progress, human rights, and world law. There is no one I know, literally on the planet, that's done more to ensure peace, progress, human rights, and world law than our special guest." Thank you very much.
Good evening. How President Kennedy would have loved this event. Here it's a special night. We're still celebrating the 100th anniversary of his birth. It's been a celebration that this library has done so much to advance. And tonight to have the former Secretary General of the United Nations here, I think, is a tribute to President Kennedy, as well as a welcome evening for all of us here. Many of us have been somewhat sparing about the direction of international events, but you've worked so hard and so long and devoted your life to the advancement of humanity that it's an honor to welcome you here tonight, Mr. Secretary General. And I know, I gather at least, that you were inspired by President Kennedy at a very young age, at 18 years of age. Can you tell us that about your going to the White House?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Before I begin to answer your questions, I'd like to first of all thank Mr. Steve Rothstein, Director of Kennedy Presidential Library Foundation, for organizing this very important, meaningful gathering on the occasion of centennial year of JFK. And thank you very much, Professor David Gergen, for moderating this. He's a very distinguished commentator and also Harvard professor with whom we've been working closely these days. He has another chance to interview me tomorrow. So Now, back to your question. I think I may be one of a very few Korean, if not whole around the world, who had the extraordinary occasion meeting with President Kennedy. When I was 18 years old, I was a senior at the high school. I was invited by American Red Cross at that time, who invited about 120 from 40 some countries, including East European countries. We were traveling for about a month around the United States. For me, I traveled through states like California, Oregon, and Washington, then flew to Washington, D.C. There we gathered all together. We were invited on 29th of August, 1962, to a Rose Garden reception by President Kennedy. It was, I think, more than a miracle for a young country boy, from a dusty South Korea, devastated by a Korean War. So it was like, for a woman, Cinderella or something like this. Yeah. We were excited, and I still remember, which made me inspired and has been my living legacy and inspiration for my life, public life. I have finished a 46-year public service, including tenure as a Secretary General of the United Nations. What it told us at that time, still vivid in my memory, you may check, maybe Director, the archive of President Kennedy. He said, because it was during the height of Cold War, he said, world leaders were not getting along well, but you young people, you can't get along well. And the national boundaries were not meaningful at the time, meaningless. The question, he said, was whether you are ready to extend your helping hands. That was quite inspiring. At that time, he had already shown his compassionate leadership for humanity, for many people, poor people around the world. And he inspired the world, all the people, to build a better world. And he even inspired American people to go into outer space, and he also inspired the young American men and women to go for volunteers by establishing a Peace Corps. Many Peace Corps later who served in Korea proudly returned to Korea as US ambassadors or successful business CEOs or educators or whatever. This is some very good legacy who has given source of inspiration to the world. This is what we have learned, and his legacy is continuing. I'm sure that this will continue down the road throughout our life. What I learned at the Kennedy School of Government in about 34 years ago, this Cuban Missile Crisis, again, gave a very clear meaning to a diplomat like myself, how you should handle the national crisis. When you address national crisis, it's not based on bombastic rhetoric by the politicians, but it's a very determined, calculated strategy. That is what you can save your people and your country. That's what I have been really trying to practice myself as a Secretary General.
Patience, and avoiding miscalculation. And he was a reader. You know, he was very influenced by Barbara Tuchman's book, and I wondered if you had found similar guidance by reading history and biography.
Many leaders may not be as patient as he, and may not be able to make a good decision at a critical time. That's why we have to learn from the history and learn from the inspiring leadership of people like John F. Kennedy. When I was a student here, I read, I think the most gripping book was The 13 Days, 13 Days by Senator Robert Kennedy. Then later, Graham Allison, Professor Graham Allison wrote The Essence of Decision. These two books gave me a great guidance and inspiration for later to be a successful foreign minister and the Secretary General of the United Nations.
Well, you all will be interested in knowing that the staff here at the library did some sleuthing, and I think they came up with a photo of you at 18 years old. Do we have it? You all could bring it up here? Oh, it's up here. Up here. Let's see.
Can you find me? There should be a very smart, handsome boy. I think I can see it.
Yeah, it's it is so reminiscent of a famous photograph of another young 18-year-old, Bill Clinton, when he was from Boise State and went to the White House, and there's this picture of him reaching out to President Kennedy, and he often cited that as his source of his inspiration in life. So you have been a diplomat, you've been a world leader now for many a year. Can you help us provide an answer to the skeptics now who say that the United Nations, for better or for worse, is becoming more irrelevant in the world? And could you help us think through that and understand the role, the continuing role and importance of the United Nations?
One very troubling comments have been during my time that there were criticism about the United Nations, about the efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability. As you said, relevance, whether United Nations is still relevant in 21st century. My answer, direct answer to them, if you have to get away with the United Nations today, tomorrow, you will have to establish another United Nations. United Nations is the most universal international organization where all the members of the United Nations can find the ground for debate to discuss all world issues, peace and security issues, development and human rights issues. The ideals and goals and principles and values of United Nations Charter represent the whole spectrum of the United Nations. Now, the very ambitious vision which have been presented by the United Nations in the form of Sustainable Development Goals or Climate Change Agreement, which was adopted in Paris 2015, they are the most ambitious, I think, far-reaching visions which only United Nations can do. No other country, however powerful or resourceful may be, like the United States, cannot do it. It is because United Nations, where everybody's vision, normally they bring national perspectives. When all these national perspectives are transformed into a global perspective, global vision for humanity, that is why United Nations is still relevant. Then how can we make United Nations much more relevant, as ever effective and efficient? That depends upon the will and support of member states, and particularly countries like the United States. United Nations, I can tell you that is a child of United States. The main vision, main principles and ideals came from US immediately after, just around the end of Second World War, and it was established immediately after Second World War. The United Nations has been playing most important role.
What do you think the most important things the United Nations could do to deal with these wars that have broken out, that have left so many refugees, so many record numbers since the Second World War? And the United Nations have been very active in Sudan, but not so much in Syria.
That's quite troubling that we still have many crises continuing in Syria, Lebanon, Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Yemen too. So there are many fires are still burning, big or small. And why these crises are now still continuing? I think because the United Nations and this whole international community is divided. I've been urging world leaders and saying that when United Nations is united, that we can deliver a lot, very effectively. When United Nations is not united, that's a problem. That's the place, the moment where you see the problem. I have been urging that members of the Security Council, particularly permanent members, 5 permanent members, they should show their global solidarity for humanity. Why these more than 5 million Syrian refugees have to flee their countries and become refugees? Why almost 12 million Syrian people inside Syria have to suffer? Why so many people around the world? Now, never in the past, in the history, except during Second World War, have we not had so many refugees? 65 million refugees now. The United Nations has to feed every day at least 135 million people. Every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
How many is the United Nations feeding? How many?
135 million.
That's what the UN feeds every day?
Yes, including 65 million refugees. We need to mobilize huge resources, but the more refugees, the more problems. I think the lesser humanitarian support come from international community. That's very troubling. That is why people are complaining against the United Nations. At this time, I count on the United States. United States is, by any standard, the most important, most resourceful, most powerful country in the world, and continuous engagement and leadership, global leadership of the United States is crucial to make United Nations united and deliverable.
Well, we can't help but turn then to the elephant in the room. And how do you respond when the new administration proposes to cut the U.S. contribution to the United Nations by 30%, proposes to slash diplomacy more generally at the State Department, and pulls back from the Paris Accords that you spent so much of your time at the UN developing and sponsoring, and you really were heroic in that? How do you think about that? How does that strike you as the former Secretary General?
That's a source of deep concern and disappointment as a former Secretary General. Even though I am not responsible for daily operation of United Nations, but United Nations is the only organization which can really help people who are in need. When such country like the United States is reducing, cutting their budgets and support for the United Nations, then it will be extremely difficult. Then it's something like, if I may say that, of course, nobody in the United States, among citizens, will want to see many people suffer. But if you do not help, then you will end up seeing such miserable scenes and tragic scenes every day continuing. When it comes to climate change, again, I cannot but express my deepest disappointment and concern at the decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. I just came back from Paris after attending international conference on climate change that was held last Saturday. 800 delegations came from all around the world. They all expressed very critical views about what United States has taken. At the same time, I am encouraged, while concerned about the political impact coming from U.S. pull-out. There's a U.S. pull-out from this Paris Agreement encouragingly has galvanized march forward by many, at least 900 business CEOs of the United States, at least a dozen big states in the United States, including California, New York, and Massachusetts, at least 12. But I think more are coming. More than 200 mayors have joined. They said that they will continue to implement this Paris Agreement. And all this support will be accounted for about $6.2 trillion. That's amazingly encouraging. And whole worldwide, I think they are marching, their march continues. Therefore, I am again taking this opportunity, urging U.S. administration to return to this Paris Agreement as soon as possible. That's what global leadership means.
I know you've been very encouraged, in particular, about California, Oregon, Washington, and Vancouver forming an alliance on climate change. And can you tell us a little bit more about that? I'm fascinated about the leadership that Jerry Brown is showing, for example, and how promising that can be.
Now, it is promising, but what I'm worried is that because of the size of GDP and economic power of United States, in every there is a certain rules that United States will take about almost 1/3 of the resources required. For example, U.S. pays 22 to 28% of total U.S. budget, regular budget and peacekeeping budget. Peacekeeping budget, U.S. pays 28%. Then when it comes to climate change, at the initiative of U.S. government, this climate fund, Green Climate Fund, the GCF, was established with the promise that $100 billion will be mobilized and will be supported to developing countries for their efforts to mitigate and adapt to changing climate change phenomena. Now, where can we have this $100 billion when U.S. is not paying? Then who will be able to pay almost $30 billion every year? It has to be mobilized by 2020. Then from 2020, every year, $100 billion must be mobilized and given to developing countries. So this is a huge impact if the U.S. is not coming back.
The argument is made by supporters of the president, indeed by the president himself, and that the agreement is deeply flawed in their view and gives advantages to China and India. China now surpasses the United States in its carbon emissions. How do you answer that charge?
Now, this tells only one side of the story. I know that certain sector of industry are affected, like coal industries. For example, admitting that there is a clear loss of employment opportunities in coal industry, but it's not because of climate change agreement. It's because of the development of technology. It's not because of climate agreement. Because of development technology, then in most of the entrepreneurs, they do not need as many people as possible. When it comes to the stage of artificial intelligence, AI, artificial intelligence, then we may have to reduce much more employment. But now there is a huge investment in clean energies, solar, wind power, and hydropowers, and even nuclear energy. Therefore, one should see comprehensive aspect now. There's a much more job opportunities created by investment in clean energy, solar and sustainable energy. That should be well looked into. I know that he has said that he was speaking for the citizens of Pittsburgh, but frankly speaking, it has become a little bit cynical, subject by many people around the world. U.S. president should, of course, take care of U.S. citizens, but U.S. cannot live alone in this interconnected world. This world is a very small world. Everything is a tightly interconnected world. Citizens of Pittsburgh are directly connected with the citizens of Africa, somewhere. So we are living in a small world. We are all family, one family member of this planet Earth.
You have told me that you actually intend to devote yourself to sustainable development. Can you tell us how you plan to do that, how you can have a continuing impact? I think that would be inspirational for many.
Again, I am very proud that United Nations, during my time as Secretary General, has been able to deliver very ambitious, most far-reaching visions in the history of the United Nations to the world. That is Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals covering whole spectrums of our life, starting from poverty eradication and zero hunger, and also including climate change. All these 17 goals covers everything: cities, oceans, transportations, decent jobs, education, gender empowerment, you name what is part of our life. The Millennium Development Goals, which ended by the end of 2015, was mainly for developing countries. Now, leaders of the world realized that both developing and developed countries should live together harmoniously. This covers both all the people around the world, and including our planet Earth. We must be wise enough to live harmoniously with our nature. We have been abusing our nature, unfortunately, particularly since the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. Then if we look at the way people use our privileges, like resources, it seems that the people believe that we have two planet Earth, but unfortunately we have only one planet Earth. Therefore, we need to know how to live together with the nature. Nature does not wait for us. Nature goes in its own way, so it is us, human beings, who have to really follow and live harmoniously with our nature. That's the basic philosophy of Sustainable Development Goals and also Climate Change Agreement, which was adopted in Paris. By that time, I declared while in office, by 2030, there will be no person who will have to go to bed hungry with a hungry stomach. and there will be nobody who will have to die from preventable diseases. This planet Earth will be 50-50 in terms of gender equality, and we'll have much better natural conditions, but it requires common efforts, solidarity, same vision, global vision, that we are one.
And you personally, what will you be doing?
As a former Secretary General, I think I still have something to do, even though I may not be paid by the United Nations. Now, when I return to Korea, as my commitment, I'm going to establish a Ban Ki-moon Center for Sustainable Development. That's what I'm going to use my own experience and vision. I'll try to foster global citizenship to young people. And I'm soon going to establish a Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens. What is required at this time is global citizenship. We are too much caring about our own country, your own country. But as I said, with the transformative development of technology, communication, transportation, information, I think what we are doing is just momentarily communicated and conveyed all throughout the world until the end of this earth. Therefore, there is, as President John F. Kennedy had already said 55 years ago, national boundaries do not mean much. We are living in one world. So I'm really going to foster global citizenship among people and try to do my best to help member states implement sustainable development goals.
Your successor has been working hard to build bridges in Washington to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, and yet at times has been frustrated and also says the withdrawal, has said publicly, the withdrawal of American leadership is handing the future to China. Handing the future to China.
Well,
is there truth to that?
Well, I'm not going to comment on this matter, but I hope that before that kind of debate emerge much more, the U.S. should continue to take global leadership. That's what I think many people around the world are looking to the United States. Of course, in our natural law, when there is a vacuum, this vacuum will be filled by anyone. If the United States really withdraws from a certain place and do less, then this vacuum created by U.S. lack of leadership may have to be filled by others, including China. Then whether it is such time, I have a serious doubt, that therefore I'm really hoping that before this kind of debate that comes more and more open, I hope leadership of United States will continue. I know that there have been a lot of changes of leadership during the last many hundreds, decades, but I have also read some books about whether American century is going to be over, etc., etc. But for me, still, U.S. leadership will count in terms of per capita GDP. There is no country which really matches that of United States. Of course, there are some countries which are higher than, in terms of military strength, in terms of value, which is very important for our humanity. Democratic rules, good governance, transparency, accountability. All these are what the American government has been, preaching and really fostering all throughout the world. And that's my sincere hope.
The president of China in Davos this last year really stepped forward to catch the falling flag, as one might say, that seeing this vacuum or this retreat of America from international institutions and mores, really said we are going to step forward and be the leader, the champion on climate change and on international trade, free markets. You grew up in South Korea. You've been a neighbor of the Chinese for a long time. Should we welcome or be apprehensive about the rise of China and its stepping into the vacuum?
I appreciate the continuing leadership role of China, and it's important that China, which has not been fully engaging in global issues, have been, I think, most committed to climate change, and they have been most committed to forming these sustainable development goals. I have also taken note of what President Xi Jinping said during a Davos forum. I think as a national leader of China, he could say so. That I understand and I interpreted that as a willingness of China to become more engaging with international community. I think China has become the largest foreign aid country when it comes to African countries, much more than Japan does. And this is most welcome. At the same time, there are still some areas for China to improve in their good governance issues, democratic rules. That's what I think the international community is now encouraging China to do much more. It's very important that China and United States, as number one and number two, G1 and G2, should fully cooperate.
The Trump administration also has been pushing China on North Korea, and the president himself is now complaining that it hasn't worked. But it's not at all clear. You have a new president in South Korea, President Moon, who is more conciliatory. But there are hawks in this country and indeed in other parts of the world who feel that the North Koreans are on a path that has to be stopped, that we've had agreements with them in the past on which they've cheated. And going back to the Clinton years, I was there, some others here have been there when we signed an agreement, the initial agreement, and they just brazenly cheated. So as a world leader now, but also one rooted in South Korea, how do we solve this problem?
Unfortunately, this situation on the Korean Peninsula, caused by continuing North Korean provocations through launching ballistic missiles and also continuing to develop nuclear weapons. Never in the past, the level of tension has been so acute and so high on the Korean Peninsula since the end of Korean War. So it's only natural that whole international community must guard against by all means. I understand that the Korean President Moon Jae-in, I think should have arrived at this time. He should be in Washington, D.C. now for his meeting with the President Trump. I hope that they will have a very successful summit meeting in addressing and trying to formulate a common strategy to deal with North Korean provocations. Now, I have been engaging in this issue during last over 20 years. what is important at this time, whole international community must be united in sending united, unequivocal message to North Korea that by continuously provoking international community, not abiding by the Security Council resolutions, then whatever their wishes may be may not be met. The only way for them is to, first of all, by fully engaging with the international community, by abiding by the relevant Security Council resolutions. There are 7 Security Council resolutions, sanctioned resolutions. There's not a country in the world who is under 7 Security Council resolution at one time like this way. And therefore, it is important that Korea, United States should show such a determined will based on strong alliance, and with the cooperation with Japan and China and Russia, I think they have to have a common strategy. In there, China has a critical, important role. As President Trump has been emphasizing all the times, China, not only as neighboring countries, their trading relationship with North Korea is almost overwhelmingly, important. 90% of North Koreans' foreign trade, import and export, is with China. 90%. So they have only 10% of trade with Korea or some other countries in the world. That's why U.S. government and South Korean government have been urging China to do much more. I know that they have been doing much more, but according to all report assessment, they might not have been doing much, enough. One message which we see from North Korean reaction vis-a-vis China is that China seems to be squeezing much more the North Koreans. In the past, even though North Koreans had some difference of opinions or some complaints against China, they have never mentioned China by name. But these days, they are criticizing China by name, by calling by China. That means their relationship is also changing, and China is also trying to impress upon North Korea to do much more.
We have some questions from the floor.
Yes.
And I'd like to turn to some of them. What was the most critical or difficult moment during your years serving as Secretary General?
There are so many, so it will be very difficult to pick one or two. The continuing tragedy caused by the conflicts, starting from Syria, or now Yemen, South Sudan, and elsewhere. These are continuing problems and concerns for me and for my successor and for all world leaders now. As I said, there have been divisions among member states of the Security Council. They have not been able to deliver effectively as required by the timing as well as the amount of resources. I again urge particularly the P5, permanent members of 5 countries should be united. That's the only way we can handle this matter. And there are, again, there are many tragic scenes which I have to endure, which I have seen. And there are many people whose human dignity and human rights are completely abused and trampled in many countries. I have seen so many women whose integrity and human rights have been totally violated. Young girls and young boys who have become child soldiers, young girls who have been sold, for trafficking. All these are very, very tragic scenes which I had to see.
You were a strong champion of women's rights while you were at the United Nations. So this question is appropriate, Bridge. How do we begin to protect women around the world from the weapon of rape?
That has been, again, one of the top priorities for the United Nations and me as a Secretary General. In 2007, I launched an initiative, Unite to Fight Against Violence Against Women. I've been appealing to world leaders, and particularly men. Then later I realized that unless we change the mentality of men, and this crime will never stop. Therefore, I again formed sort of a men leaders network, starting from Archbishop Desmond Tutu and several world leaders, many business CEOs, and social network leaders. This has been largely working, but still there is a very sad things are still continuing. So United Nations has taken zero tolerance policy, particularly among UN staff and peacekeeping soldiers. So I have taken very firm and strict guidelines, but this requires whole world's support. It's not only the United Nations, it's not only government or law enforcement officials. I think all civil society leaders, they have to work together to eradicate this sexual violence against women.
Were you surprised? I must confess that I've been shocked sometimes to read about the peacekeepers in various parts of the world raping women.
We were angry, and I have been making sure that there will be zero tolerance. And when, depending upon the level of crimes, we have been repatriating these soldiers who committed violence. The one difficult thing as far as the United Nations is concerned, that we do not have this authority to punish these people who committed crimes. Then only way United Nations can do is to repatriate those soldiers to their home countries and ask their local government, to put them in the justice process. And we've been trying to follow up what had been taken against these perpetrators. That's the limit, because we do not have prosecutors, we do not have any courts, our own court, except when United Nations has decided to establish a special tribunal for special cases.
Well, thank you for what you have been doing in so many of these areas. Another question is about that one often hears this raised in the United States and elsewhere. That is how to deal with the veto issue in the United Nations. Every time the UN has to make big decisions concerning the Middle East, we see almost always a veto from the United States concerning the Palestinians.
Well, I would not focus on Middle East specifically, because the U.S. has been casting many vetoes, but overall, more vetoes have been cast by another member states. Like Russia has been, I think, casting most number of vetoes. This is a charter provision, and there have been many complaints about this veto power. But in reality, when the member states of the United Nations have not been able to find the common groundwork to change the Security Council, to reform the Security Council, we have not been able to do anything because you have to amend the Charter of the United Nations. When U.S. is holding veto power, then you can easily imagine that they will not agree to this. When it comes to Russia or some other veto power countries, they will never give up their veto power.
Right.
Yeah, that's the problem now.
Should we expand it to more countries, 9 countries, 12 countries?
I think there has been some widely shared, almost the near consensus views that Security Council should be reformed in a more democratic, a more representative. That means we have to expand. More democratic means we have to be more accountable and transparent in the process of decision making. Then veto power is now has been one of the subjects, but before touching on veto powers, I have been urging member states that there should be a reform of expanding permanent members, with or without veto powers. That depends upon the decision of the member states. At least expand the number of Security Council. Then many ideas have been put forward, from 21 to 24. I think that seems to be the most commonly talked about numbers, but no decisions has been made yet.
Another related question to the veto is, why is the United Nations so biased against Israel?
Well, that's not because of me. I can proudly say that during my time as a Secretary General, I'm the most committed Secretary General to make sure that Israel's right and presence should be enhanced as equal as other members. During my time, Israel has been able to get more jobs, higher jobs, including some chairmanship of Sixth Committee, Legal Committee. And I have appointed many Israeli citizens, but this is caused by some regional political issues caused by the unresolved Middle East peace process. There's a huge bloc in the Middle East, except Israel. Then they have been surrounded by all these Middle East countries who have been always, against whatever Israel has been doing. At the same time, there have been many Gazan crises, at least 3 times during my term. So I had to deal with this imminent crisis which happened in Gaza. Therefore, I sincerely hope that there will be some swift resolution of this Middle East peace process. I have been saying that Middle East peace process has been playing as sort of core of all these issues. From this, a lot of crises have been expanding.
Thank you. There's another question here about the Middle East, and it basically asks, how should the United Nations, how should the world encourage Iran to become a peaceful member of the world community?
I also have been engaging myself with the leadership of Iran, including Supreme Leader, President, and Foreign Ministers, and many others during my 10-year time. One encouraging development was that the nuclear issue was agreed upon among P5+1 and Iran. I sincerely hope that this comprehensive package deal will be faithfully implemented. That's, I think, a better way, more practical way to engage Iran toward the outside world. More engagement from Iran in normal activities of the United Nations will be much, much more beneficial. I'm at this time concerned about certain discussions within the United States about the very critical views about this nuclear deal. This is the deal which have taken many years, and it has a consensus of all P5 and European Union and also Germany. And therefore, I think it is comprising most of the important partners in dealing with nuclear issues of Iran. Therefore, even though there may be some weak points, this weak point should be later on amended or upgraded. But at this time, as it is agreed, as it is now, I think it should be fully implemented. I have been urging Iranians also do the same things, while I have been urging all this, what we call a P5+1+1 agreement, should be fully implemented.
If you had to make a bet upon the future of Iran in the next 20 years, President Obama made a bet, in effect, that if you had an agreement on nuclear weapons and they postponed or stopped seeking nuclear weapons for, say, 15 years, that by then a new generation would come to power in Iran that would be much more interested in joining the 21st century and be much more open and contemporary and would be less interested in a nuclear, having nuclear capacity. Others argue, no, the mullahs are going to be in charge for the foreseeable future. That's just not going to work.
We should learn from North Korean nuclear negotiations between United States and North Korea, which has allowed North Korea to develop nuclear weapons in the end. Once nuclear weapon is in the hand, it will be much more difficult, even extremely difficult to resolve this issue. That's what we are now experiencing vis-a-vis North Korean issue. Because when there was a Geneva Agreed Framework in 1994, when there was implementation process was going on, with the change of U.S. administration from Democratic to Republican Party, this agreed framework was canceled unilaterally. Of course, there was allegation and some proof that North Korea was developing uranium nuclear weapon programs. Now, moving to Iranian deal, again, it will be much more practically wiser and practically right to make sure that this agreement is implemented so that Iranians will have never access to nuclear weapons. They committed themselves that they will not have a nuclear weapons program. And once, by any reason, if it is not implemented, if no Iranians are allowed to go on their own way, in few years' time they will be a nuclear. They will have nuclear weapon in their hands. Then you will have to regret what you.
So you think it becomes irreversible once? Yeah.
It's not reversible. Once they have it, it's almost not reversible. Our position has always been that comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement, but it never happened. Yeah. It never happened.
Yeah. It seems particularly appropriate to be discussing this at President Kennedy's library because he devoted so much of his presidency to stopping the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Yes, so we have to learn from the legacy of President Kennedy. He has really shown such a far-reaching visions even including all this disarmament, outer space, and even I think his legacy should be emulated, fully practiced by succeeding generations.
We have two more questions.
Yes.
Or I should say, I think we should respect your time, and I'll limit it to two more questions. But just a young man, Justin Rich, who goes to the Boston College High School, and he asked the question, what can high school and college students do to create change in the world?
I'm telling young students, young people here, to have global mind. It may be important you learn the science or mathematics or whatever subjects you may be interested. This knowledge which you will learn from the school may not be as important as you foster global vision as a global citizen. I know that young people, they have a full of passion. I think you have a lot of dreams. It's only natural that young people have a full of passion. But when full of passion is not accompanied with the compassion, then you don't know where you may be ending up. This is very undesirable. Then try to be and look beyond the boundary of United States, particularly the US citizens who are living in most affluent societies, who do not know much about what poverty means and how sick people look like, what kind of discriminations other people have in other parts of the world. That I'm really asking you, be a global citizen. That's my answer to you, to really contribute to this society. I think that will be much more important than some subjects which you are learning from the school.
But final question. How would you like to be remembered?
I'd like to be remembered as a person who worked hard and hard for humanity. I have been really working with a strong belief that UN Secretary General should be a voice of voiceless people and defender of defenseless people. You will be surprised to see there are so many people who do not have their voice, whether political voice or whatever, social voice. But United Nations, the Secretary General, is a voice of voiceless people. I declare that I will be a voice of the voiceless people and defender of the defenseless people. That I want to be remembered.
Mr. Secretary General, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.